Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. The Oconee Country Club smelled like old money and fresh betrayal. Russell, Rusty, Maddox sat at the head table, his calloused hands wrapped around a glass of sweet tea, while 43 people he'd worked with for decades raised their drinks in his honor. The banner above the bar read, "Happy Retirement, Rusty," in gold letters that caught the overhead lights. Lorna stood first, her red dress hugging curves that still turned heads at 59. She'd spent 2 hours getting ready, he knew, because he'd heard her on the phone with Hadley discussing which jewelry would photograph best. The diamond necklace he'd bought for their 20th anniversary sparkled at her throat. Ladies and gentlemen, Lorna's voice carried that smooth Georgia charm she perfected over 3 decades of marriage. Tonight we celebrate a man who gave 40 years to Milliken Industries. A man who never missed a day, never complained, and always put his family first. Rusty watched her face as she spoke. The practiced smile, the way her eyes scanned the crowd instead of looking at him. He'd learned to read these signals over the years, the same way he'd learned to read pressure gauges and machine tolerances. Russell Maddox is a man of honor, Lorna continued, her voice growing stronger. A man who always keeps his word, who always puts others before himself. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Bill Harrison from engineering nodded. Pete Coleman from maintenance raised his beer. These were good men, honest men, who trusted Rusty with their problems and their friendship for decades. Hadley rose beside her mother, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. At 28, she looked like a younger version of Lorna, same sharp cheekbones, same calculating green eyes, same ability to smile while planning your destruction. "Daddy," Hadley said, her voice pitched for the crowd but her eyes fixed on his face. "You've always been there for us. Working those long hours, missing dinners, missing school plays, missing birthdays. Also Mom and I could have the life we deserved." The room fell quiet. Something in her tone had changed, like a cloud passing over the sun. "You sacrificed everything for your family," Hadley continued. "Your time, your energy, your dreams. And now it's time for your reward." She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. Lorna produced another from her clutch. They placed both on the table in front of him with the ceremony of a ritual sacrifice. "Congratulations on 40 years of wasting your life, old man," Hadley said, her smile never wavering even as her words cut through the room like a blade. Lorna's voice was honey over glass. "Open them, Russell. Your retirement gift." The first envelope contained divorce papers. The second held financial documents, pension transfers, account closures, power of attorney revocations. All dated, all notarized, all legal. "You get nothing," Lorna said, her mask finally slipping to reveal the face he'd glimpsed in unguarded moments over the past 2 years. "Your pension is ours. You signed it away years ago, remember? That power of attorney you gave me when you had that heart scare." The room had gone dead silent. 43 people sat frozen, their drinks halfway to their lips, their minds trying to process what they were witnessing. Rusty read through the papers with a methodical attention he'd once applied to blueprint specifications. Every signature was his. Every date was accurate. Every legal requirement had been met. They'd been planning this for months, maybe years. He looked up at his wife of 31 years and his daughter, who'd called him daddy until she was 16. 2 women he'd worked 70-hour weeks to provide for. 2 women he'd scraped together college funds for, vacation money for, a house payment and car payments and credit card payments for. "You understand what this means?" Lorna asked, her voice carrying that edge of triumph she got when she'd won an argument. Rusty nodded once. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen the same Mont Blanc Lorna had given him for his 50th birthday. The irony wasn't lost on him. He signed the divorce papers without reading them. Signed the financial documents without question. Signed away 40 years of marriage and 40 years of savings with the same steady hand that had signed engineering reports and safety inspections and work orders. "Understood," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. That he stood, straightened his tie, and walked toward the exit. Behind him, he heard Lorna's nervous laugh, Hadley's sharp intake of breath, the scrape of chairs as people began to murmur, "I could tee the door." He paused and looked back. Not at Lorna or Hadley, but at the men he'd worked beside. Bill Harrison's face was pale with shock. Pete Coleman's hands were clenched into fists. "Thank you all for coming," Rusty said. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." He walked out into the Georgia night and didn't look back. The house on Maple Street looked the same as it had for 15 years, two-story colonial with white shutters and a lawn Rusty had mowed every Saturday since Hadley started high school. The porch light was off, but he could see movement behind the living room curtains that he parked his truck in the driveway and sat for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Through the thin walls, he could hear Lorna's voice, high and excited. Hadley's laughter, the clink of wine glasses. The front door was unlocked. It always was, Lorna said. Locked doors were for people who had something to hide. He stepped into the foyer and heard their voices more clearly now, coming from the kitchen. "Should have seen his face," Hadley was saying. "Like a kicked dog?" "He signed everything," Lorna replied. "Just like Bo said he would. 40 years of conditioning don't break easy. Think he'll cause trouble. What's he going to do? He's 62 years old with a high school education and no savings. Bo says men like Russell don't fight back, they just disappear." Rusty stood in the hallway and listened to his wife and daughter dissect his character like surgeons examining a tumor. Part of him wondered how long they'd been having these conversations, how many nights he'd worked late while they planned his destruction in the kitchen he'd remodeled with his own hands. He climbed the stairs to their bedroom, his former bedroom, and began packing. Clothes first, the practical things. Work boots, jeans, the flannel shirts Lorna always complained made him look like a hillbilly. His navy dress uniform, still pressed and ready after all these years. From the back of the closet, he retrieved a small fireproof safe he'd installed behind the hanging clothes. Inside were documents Lorna had never seen. Birth certificates, military records, insurance policies, and other papers he'd kept private. Also a burner phone he'd bought 3 months ago when he'd first suspected what was coming. The conversations from downstairs continued, punctuated by laughter and the sound of wine being poured. They thought they were safe, thought their victory was complete. They had no idea that for the past 6 weeks, Rusty had been recording every word through a baby monitor he'd hidden in the kitchen vent. The same baby monitor they'd bought when Hadley was born, the one that had sat and used in a closet for 27 years until Rusty had found a new purpose for it. He'd connected it to a Bluetooth speaker in his workshop, turning their own home into a surveillance system they'd never suspected. He packed his tools next to good ones, the ones his father had passed down and he'd planned to give to a son he'd never had. Socket sets, wrenches, measuring instruments calibrated to within thousandths of an inch. These tools had built his reputation, earned his living, and they'd do so again. Russell's such a creature of habit, he heard Lorna say as he moved through the house. Same coffee every morning, same lunch every day, same route to work. He'll probably rent some cheap apartment and spend his golden years watching TV and drinking beer. "At least we won't have to pretend anymore," Hadley replied. "God, the way he looks at you sometimes, Mom. Like he still thinks you're in love with him." "I was never in love with him. I was in love with what he could provide." Rusty paused at the top of the stairs, a box of personal items in his hands. 31 years of marriage reduced to a single sentence. He wondered if she'd always felt that way, or if the feeling had died slowly. Like a plant starved of water, he loaded his truck in darkness, making 3 trips to empty what he wanted from the house. Not much when measured against 3 decades of accumulated life. But then, most of what they'd accumulated had been bought with his labor and paid for with his sweat. On his final trip, he stopped in the kitchen doorway. Lorna and Hadley sat at the island he'd built from reclaimed barnwood, wine glasses in hand, papers spread between them like battle plans. "Ladies," he said quietly. They spun around, faces flushed with wine and victory. Lorna's hand flew to her throat, fingers touching the diamond necklace. "Russell," she said, trying to recover her composure. "We thought you'd gone to a hotel. Just collecting a few things." He gestured to the papers on the counter. "Looks like you've got everything under control." Hadley lifted her chin in defiance. "We did what we had to do. You would have just wasted it all on fishing trips and truck parts. Maybe so, Rusty agreed. Guess we'll never know now. He turned to leave, then paused. By the way, you might want to check the kitchen vent. That old baby monitor's been acting up lately. Picks up all kinds of signals. He walked out before they could respond, leaving them to puzzle over his words. Let them wonder what he meant. Let them search the house and find the device and realize how much he'd heard. Fear was a powerful teacher, and they had lessons coming. Rusty drove through the night with no destination in mind, just the need to put distance between himself and the wreckage of his old life. The truck's headlights cut through darkness thick as black velvet, and the radio played old country songs that matched his mood that he stopped at a truck stop outside Macon and sat in a booth that smelled like coffee and diesel fuel, watching 18-wheelers come and go like ships passing in the night. The waitress, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, poured him coffee without being asked. Long night, she asked. Long life, Rusty replied. He pulled out the burner phone and scrolled through contacts he'd programmed over the past months. People from his old life before Lorna. People who remembered the man he'd been before 30 years of marriage had worn him down to someone he barely recognized. The first call went to Wyatt Tillman in Savannah. His old Navy buddy had run a bar called The Anchor for 15 years. Serving drinks to cops and construction workers and anyone else who needed a place where nobody asked questions. Rusty, Wyatt's voice was gravelly from cigarettes and late nights. Jesus, it's 2 a.m. You dead or in jail? Neither. But I might need a place to stay for a while. Bad as that. Worse. Doors always open, brother. You know that. The second call was harder. He'd been putting it off for 28 years, telling himself there was never a right time, never enough courage. But courage was a luxury he could no longer afford. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. Hello, Gavin? It's Russell. Russell Maddox. Silence stretched between them like a bridge neither had ever dared to cross. I know who you are, Gavin said finally. His voice carried the educated cadence of a man who'd made something of himself. But underneath, Rusty could hear echoes of the boy he'd never really known. I need help, Rusty said, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. From me? After 34 years. I know I don't have the right to ask. No, you don't. But Gavin didn't hang up. What kind of help? Rusty told him everything. The divorce, the financial betrayal, the years of lies and manipulation. He talked until the coffee grew cold, and the waitress had refilled his cup 3 times, and Gavin listened without interruption. Where are you now? Gavin asked when the story was finished. Truck stop outside Macon. Heading to Savannah. I'll meet you there tomorrow. Text me the address. Gavin, we'll talk tomorrow. Face to face, like we should have done years ago. The line went dead. Rusty stared at the phone, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life or the smartest decision. Maybe both, but he drove the rest of the way to Savannah as dawn broke over the Georgia coast, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded him of better times. The Anchor sat on a side street near the historic district, a narrow building squeeze between a pawn shop and a bail bondsman like the period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to read. Wyatt was waiting for him, 66 years old, but still built like the Marine he'd been 40 years ago. His hair was gray now, his face lined by sun and worry, but his handshake was firm and his eyes were clear. You look like hell, Wyatt said. Feel worse. Come on, let's get you fed and cleaned up. Then you can tell me what kind of war we're fighting. Back in Athens, Lorna woke to 43 missed calls on her phone. The first was from her lawyer, the second from her bank, the rest from numbers she didn't recognize. Her hands shook as she scrolled through voicemails, each one bringing worse news than the last. The pension accounts were frozen. The joint savings had been emptied. The credit cards were canceled. Even her personal checking account, which she'd thought was separate from Russell's name, showed a 0 balance. This is impossible, she told Hadley, who sat at the kitchen counter looking pale and hungover. He signed everything. We have the papers. Call Bo, Hadley said. He'll know what to do. But Bo's phone went straight to voicemail. His gym was closed, a temporarily out of business sign taped to the front door. His apartment was empty, his lease terminated, his forwarding address unknown. Lorna stood in her kitchen, the kitchen Russell had remodeled with his own hands, and felt the walls closing in around her. She'd been so sure of her victory, so confident in her planning. Now she wondered what else she'd missed, what other traps Russell had set while she was too busy celebrating to notice. The baby monitor was still where they'd found it, hidden in the vent above the stove. She'd smashed it with a hammer, but the damage was already done. Russell knew everything, had heard every word, had been planning his counterattack while she thought she was winning the war. "What do we do now?" Hadley asked. Lorna stared out the window at the empty driveway where Russell's truck used to sit. For 31 years, she'd taken that truck for granted, the way she'd taken everything else about her husband for granted. Now she wondered if she'd underestimated the quiet man who'd fixed her problems and paid her bills and loved her with a devotion she'd never deserved. "We fight back," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "With what? He's got everything. He's got what we gave him. But there are other ways to hurt a man like Russell. Other pressures we can apply." But even as she spoke the words, Lorna felt doubt creeping in like cold air through a cracked window. Russell had never been the kind of man to fold under pressure. He was more like steel. The harder you pressed, the stronger he became. The anchor smelled like sawdust and memories, its walls covered with faded photographs of Marines and sailors who'd found refuge in its dim corners over the years. Rusty sat at the bar nursing a beer he hadn't touched, watching Wyatt work through the evening crowd with the easy confidence of a man who'd found his calling point. 3 days had passed since he'd walked out of his old life. 3 days of sleeping in the small apartment above the bar. 3 days of planning his next move while his former family scrambled to understand what had happened to their carefully laid plans. "You're thinking too loud," Maxine Carter said as she slid onto the bar stool beside him. Max had been Wyatt's on-and-off girlfriend for 5 years, a nurse at the Veterans Administration Hospital who'd seen enough broken men to recognize the signs. "Sorry," Rusty said. "Didn't mean to bring the mood down." "Honey, the mood in this place was down when Carter was president. The first one." Max signaled Wyatt for a whiskey. "Besides, Wyatt told me what happened. Those women did you dirty." She was 60 years old with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen everything twice. Her uniform scrubs were faded from too many washings, and her hands showed the wear of 3 decades spent caring for people who couldn't care for themselves. "They did what they thought was best for them," Rusty said. "Bullshit." Max's voice carried the flat authority of someone who'd stopped believing in pretty lies years ago. "They did what was easiest. There's a difference." Wyatt approached with a bottle of bourbon and 3 glasses. "You ready to talk business? Or are you planning to sit here feeling sorry for yourself until Social Security kicks in?" "What kind of business?" "The kind that makes your problems disappear." Wyatt poured 3 fingers of bourbon into each glass. "You remember Tommy Castellanos?" Rusty nodded. Tommy had been their squad leader in the Navy, a man who'd saved their lives more times than either could count. After discharge, he'd gone into private security, then private investigation, then things that weren't discussed in polite company. "Tommy owes me a favor," Wyatt continued. "Several favors, actually. He's got people who can make financial problems go away, make paperwork disappear, make sure the right documents end up in the wrong hands." "I don't want anyone hurt," Rusty said. "Nobody's talking about hurt. We're talking about justice. There's a difference." Max leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I can fake medical records if we need them. Make it look like you had early-stage dementia when you signed those papers. Plenty of judges would throw out a financial agreement signed by a man with cognitive issues." Rusty considered their offers. These are good people, loyal people, who'd stood by him when his own family had turned their backs. But something in him rebelled against the idea of fighting dirty, even against opponents who'd shown no such restraint. "Let me try a different approach first," he said. "If it doesn't work, we'll talk about Plan B." "What approach is that?" Wyatt asked. "Legal. Clean. By the book." Max snorted. "They didn't fight clean." "No, they didn't. But I'm not them." The door chimed as someone entered the bar. Rusty looked up and felt his breath catch in his throat. The man walking toward them was 34 years old, tall and lean with dark hair, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you could do. "Gavin," Rusty said, standing. "Russell." They faced each other across 34 years of silence and regret. Gavin wore an expensive suit that fit perfectly, carried himself like a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. But his eyes were Russell's eyes, the same shade of blue-gray that had looked back at Rusty from mirrors his entire life. "You look good," Rusty said. "You look tired. Been a long week." Gavin glanced around the bar, taking in the faded photographs and scarred tables and the kind of clientele that paid in cash and minded their own business. "This where you're staying? For now. We need to talk. Somewhere private." Wyatt gestured toward a back room behind the bar. "You can use the office. I'll make sure nobody disturbs you." The office was cramped and cluttered, dominated by a desk covered in invoices and liquor distributor catalogs. Gavin sat across from Rusty and studied him with the kind of analytical attention that had probably made him successful in business. "You want to explain why you're calling me now?" Gavin asked, "After 34 years of nothing. Because I need help, and you're the only family I've got left." "Family?" Gavin's voice was flat. "You send money every month for 28 years, but you never call, never visit, never even send a birthday card. That's not family, Russell. That's guilt payments." Rusty flinched at the accuracy of the assessment. "You're right. I was a coward. I let your mother convince me that staying away was better for everyone, and I took the easy way out. Mom's been dead for 6 years. I know. I paid for the funeral, anonymously, through lawyers. Even then, you couldn't face me." They sat in silence, the weight of lost years pressing down on them like a physical thing. Finally, Gavin leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Tell me about this woman who screwed you over." Rusty told the story again, filling in details he'd glossed over on the phone. Gavin listened without expression, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood the legal and financial implications better than Rusty had expected. "You still have her recordings?" Gavin asked when the story was finished. "Stored in 3 separate locations." "Good. We'll need them." Gavin pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts. "I've got lawyers who specialize in elder fraud. We can file charges, get injunctions, freeze their assets until this gets sorted out." "I thought you were in tech." "I am. Cybersecurity consulting. But when you make the kind of money I make, you learn to surround yourself with the right people." Gavin looked up from his phone. "Why didn't you fight back 30 years ago?" "What do you mean?" "When Mom told you to stay away. When she said I was better off without you. Why didn't you fight for me?" Rusty felt the question like a punch to the gut. He'd asked himself the same thing 1,000 times over the years, never finding an answer that satisfied him. "Because I was 28 years old and scared," he said finally. "Because your mother was smart and educated and had family money, and I was a Navy mechanic with a high school diploma. Because when she said I'd ruin your chances if I stayed in your life, I believed her. So you just walked away. I sent money. Money isn't a father." "No, it's not." Rusty met his son's eyes. "I made a mistake. A lot of mistakes. I can't undo them, but I could try to do better going forward." Gavin studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, we'll deal with your immediate problem first. Then we'll see about the rest." He made 3 phone calls, speaking in the rapid, confident cadence of a man accustomed to getting results. By the time he finished, Rusty had lawyers, accountants, and private investigators working on his behalf. "This is going to get expensive," Rusty said. "I've got money. I can't let you pay for this. You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing to do it." Gavin stood and straightened his tie. "Besides, you've been paying my way for 28 years. Time I returned the favor." He headed for the door, then paused. "One more thing. I looked into this Beau character. Turns out he's got some interesting financial problems of his own. Might be worth exploring." After Gavin left, Rusty sat alone in the cluttered office and tried to process what had just happened. For 34 years, he'd carried the weight of his abandonment like a stone in his chest. Now, in the space of an hour, his son had not only forgiven him, but offered to help fight his battles. Maybe it was too little, too late. Maybe they'd never have the relationship that had been stolen from them by fear and pride and the casual cruelty of people who thought they knew what was best. But it was a start, and sometimes a start was enough. 2 weeks later, Lorna sat in her lawyer's office, staring at documents that made no sense. Harold Griggs had been the family attorney for 8 years, handling their wills and real estate transactions with the kind of avuncular competence that came with 40 years of small-town practice. I don't understand, Lorna said. How can the pension be gone? Harold adjusted his glasses and shuffled through the papers again, as if the words might change if he looked at them differently. According to these records, Russell transferred the pension benefits into a family trust 24 months ago. You signed the paperwork. I never signed anything like that. Your signature is right here. Harold pointed to a document that looked official and binding and completely foreign to Lorna's eyes. Notarized and witnessed. Lorna studied the signature. It looked like hers, the same flowing script she'd used for 30 years. But she had no memory of signing it, no memory of any trust, no memory of any conversation about transferring pension benefits. Who's the trustee? She asked. Gavin Maddox. The name meant nothing to her. She'd never heard Russell mention anyone named Gavin, never seen the name on any documents or correspondence. Who is he? According to the records, he's Russell's son. The words hit her like a physical blow. Russell doesn't have a son. Apparently he does. Born in 1991, according to the birth certificate. Mother listed as Jennifer Walsh. Lorna felt the room spin around her. Jennifer Walsh. She remembered that name from the early days of her marriage, when Russell would sometimes get phone calls that made him go quiet and distant. She'd assumed it was an old girlfriend, someone from his past who couldn't let go. This is fraud, she said. Russell never told me about any son. That doesn't make the trust invalid, Harold said gently. Husbands aren't required to inform their wives about all their financial decisions, especially when it comes to assets they held before the marriage. But I'm his wife. Doesn't that give me rights? You were his wife. The divorce is final. Lorna stared at the papers spread across Harold's desk, trying to find some loophole, some technicality that would restore her claim to the money she'd counted on for her future. But the documents were airtight, professionally prepared, legally unassailable. What about the house? She asked. Harold shuffled through more papers. Also in the trust. Has been for 18 months. That's impossible. I live there. You live there with Russell's permission. But ownership transferred to the trust when Russell signed it over as part of estate planning. Lorna felt panic rising in her throat like bile. He can't just take everything. There are laws about marital property. There are. But most of Russell's assets were acquired before your marriage or kept in separate accounts during the marriage. Under Georgia law, those remain his individual property. She left Harold's office in a daze, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd learned. Everything she'd counted on, everything she'd planned for, had been built on assumptions that turned out to be wrong. A.T. home, Russell's home. She corrected herself. She found Hadley waiting in the kitchen with a bottle of wine and an expression of barely controlled panic. The gym is closed, Hadley announced without preamble. Beau's phone is disconnected. I drove by his apartment, and there's an eviction notice on the door. He's gone, vanished, along with the $15,000 I loaned him to invest in expanding the business. Lorna poured herself a glass of wine with shaking hands. We've been played, all of us. She told Hadley about the trust, about the mysterious son, about the careful way Russell had protected his assets while she'd been planning his destruction. With each revelation, Hadley's face grew paler. How long has he been planning this? Hadley asked. Years, maybe. Or maybe he just got lucky and we got stupid. There has to be something we can do. Some way to fight back. Lorna thought about the recordings Russell had made, the evidence he'd gathered of their conversations with Beau. She thought about the son she'd never heard of, the lawyers who were probably already filing papers on Russell's behalf, the web of legal protections he'd woven around himself while she'd been focused on the wrong things. Maybe, she said, but we're not fighting Russell anymore. We're fighting people with money and education and connections. People who play this game better than we do. So we just give up. We regroup. We figure out what we have left, and we build from there. But even as she spoke the words, Lorna felt doubt eating at her confidence like acid. She'd underestimated Russell once, assuming he was the same compliant man who'd spent 30 years deferring to her judgment. Now she wondered what other surprises he had waiting, what other traps she'd walked into while thinking she was the hunter instead of the prey. Beau Riker sat in his leased BMW outside a strip mall in Duluth, watching repo men load his exercise equipment onto a flatbed truck. 6 months ago, he'd been the king of his small domain, owner of 3 gyms, lover to 2 married women, and architect of what he'd thought was the perfect con. Now he was $30,000 in debt, homeless, and wanted by the IRS for tax evasion that had somehow come to light at the worst possible moment. Someone had sent anonymous tips to the authorities, complete with financial records that Bo had thought were safely hidden, that he suspected Russell Maddox, but couldn't prove it. The old man had vanished completely, leaving no trace except the wreckage of Bo's carefully constructed life. Lorna and Hadley were calling constantly, demanding explanations he couldn't give and solutions he didn't have. His phone buzzed with another call from Lorna. He let it go to voicemail, along with the 15 others she'd left that day. He had nothing to tell her except the truth that he'd been outplayed by a man he'd thought was too old and too tired to fight back. The repo men finished loading the truck and drove away, taking the last remnants of his business empire. Bo started the BMW and headed north, toward his sister in Tennessee, who might let him sleep on her couch until he figured out his next move. Behind him, he left 2 women who'd trusted him with their futures and their finances. Women who were about to learn that the man they'd dismissed as a broken-down factory worker had been playing a much deeper game than any of them had imagined. Back in Athens, Lorna and Hadley sat in what had once been their kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of their shattered plans. The wine was gone, replaced by cheap vodka that burned going down and left them both raw and angry. "I trusted him," Hadley said for the 100th time. "I actually trusted that piece of trash. We both did. How could we be so stupid?" Lorna didn't answer. She was thinking about Russell, about the quiet way he'd absorbed their insults and humiliation at the retirement dinner. She'd assumed his silence meant defeat, but now she wondered if it had been something else entirely. Planning. Calculation. The patience of a man who'd learned to think 3 moves ahead. "We need to find this Gavin person," she said. "Figure out who he is and what he wants. I already tried. There's nothing online about any Gavin Maddox connected to Russell. It's like he doesn't exist. Everyone exists somewhere. We just have to look harder." But even as she spoke, Lorna felt the futility of their position settling over her like a weight. They were amateurs playing against professionals, using emotion and anger where their opponents used logic and law. The doorbell rang, cutting through the alcohol-soaked atmosphere like a knife. Lorna stumbled to answer it, expecting bill collectors or process servers or some other harbinger of the financial apocalypse they were facing. Instead, she found a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to see right through her. "Mrs. Maddox?" the woman asked. "Yes. My name is Maxine Carter. I'm a friend of your husband's." "Ex-husband," Lorna corrected automatically. "Right? Ex-husband. May I come in?" Lorna led Max into the living room, where Hadley sat curled on the couch with a glass of vodka and a face like thunder. "I wanted to talk to you about Russell," Max said, settling into the chair Russell had always favored for watching television. "What about him? I think you ladies might have made a mistake." Hadley laughed bitterly. "Yeah, we married him in the first place." Max's expression didn't change. "Russell's a good man. Loyal, hardworking, honest to a fault. The kind of man who'd give you the shirt off his back if you asked nicely. Is there a point to this?" Lorna asked. "The point is that men like Russell don't usually fight back when they're wronged. They just take it and move on." Max leaned forward slightly. "But when they do fight back, they fight to win. Are you threatening us? I'm trying to help you understand what you're up against. Russell's got friends now. People who care about him. People who want to see him happy. People who don't much like what you did to him. We didn't do anything illegal. Maybe not. But you hurt a good man for no reason except greed, and that doesn't sit well with folks like us." Max stood and walked to the door, then paused. "You might want to think about apologizing. Might make things easier for everyone involved." After she left, Lorna and Hadley sat in silence, processing the implications of the visit. Someone was watching them, monitoring their situation, probably planning their next move, while Lorna and Hadley stumbled around in the dark. "What do you think she meant?" Hadley asked. "I think she meant we're in more trouble than we thought." Lorna walked to the window and looked out at the street where she'd lived for 15 years. Nothing had changed. Same houses, same neighbors, same quiet suburban peace. But somehow everything felt different now, as if the foundation of her world had shifted when she wasn't paying attention. Somewhere out there, Russell was building a new life with people who cared about him. People who would stand by him the way she never had, who would fight for him the way she'd fought against him. For the first time since the retirement dinner, Lorna wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. The law offices of Preston and Associates occupied the top floor of a glass tower in downtown Atlanta, with windows that looked out over the city like the eyes of a predator surveying its territory. Gavin sat across from Miranda Preston, one of the state's most feared family law attorneys, watching her review the evidence he'd compiled against Lorna and Hadley. "This is quite comprehensive," Miranda said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of old Atlanta money and newer legal education. "Financial fraud, conspiracy, elder abuse. Your father built a solid case. Will it hold up in court? Oh, it'll more than hold up. The question is whether we want to take it that far." Miranda closed the file and leaned back in her chair. Sometimes the threat of prosecution is more effective than prosecution itself. Gavin considered this. He'd spent 2 weeks learning about his father's marriage, piecing together 30 years of gradual emotional abuse disguised as love. The more he learned, the angrier he became not just at Lorna and Hadley, but at himself for staying away so long, for letting Russell face this alone. "What do you recommend?" "We file charges. All of them. Fraud, conspiracy, theft by deception. Make it very public, very embarrassing. Then we offer to make it all go away in exchange for a complete surrender of any claim to your father's assets. And if they refuse, then we destroy them. Legally, financially, socially. By the time we're finished, they'll be lucky to qualify for food stamps." Miranda's smile was sharp as a blade. She'd built her reputation by fighting for clients who'd been wronged by spouses and family members, and she took particular pleasure in cases like this one. "There's something else you should know," she continued. "We've been investigating this Bo Riker character. Turns out he has quite an interesting financial history." She opened another file and spread documents across her desk. Bank records, tax returns, business licenses, all painting a picture of a man who'd made a career out of manipulating vulnerable women. "He's done this before," Gavin said, reading through the papers. "At least 3 times that we can document. Always the same pattern: target a lonely or unhappy wife, convince her to betray her husband, then disappear with whatever money he can steal. Where is he now? We're working on that. But when we find him, he'll face charges in multiple states." Gavin thought about his father, quietly carrying the burden of betrayal while the people who'd wronged him scattered like cockroaches when the lights came on. Russell had always been too honorable for his own good, too willing to forgive people who didn't deserve forgiveness. "File the charges," Gavin said. "All of them. Are you sure? This will get ugly." They made it ugly when they humiliated my father in front of his friends. Miranda nodded and reached for her phone. "I'll have the papers filed by end of business today. The media will have them by tomorrow morning." 2 days later, Lorna woke to find reporters camped outside her house. The story had everything local news loved: betrayal, greed, a working-class hero wronged by his scheming family. The footage from the retirement dinner, somehow leaked to the media, played on every channel in Georgia. She watched herself on television, raising a toast to the man she was about to destroy, and felt sick with recognition. The woman on screen looked cold, calculating, cruel, everything Lorna had never thought of herself as being. Her phone rang constantly: reporters, former friends, distant relatives who wanted to know if the stories were true. She'd stopped answering after the first dozen calls, all of them hostile, all of them treating her like the villain in a story she'd thought she was writing. Hadley fared even worse. Her job in marketing depended on public image and client trust, both of which evaporated overnight when her face appeared on the news as the daughter who called her father an old man. By Friday, she was unemployed, her reputation in ruins, her social media accounts flooded with angry messages from strangers. "This is character assassination," Lorna told Harold Griggs when she finally reached him on his personal cell phone. "It's accurate reporting," Harold replied wearily. "I've seen the evidence they're planning to present. Lorna, you need to seriously consider settling this thing before it goes to trial. We didn't do anything wrong. You conspired with a known con artist to defraud your husband of his retirement benefits. In Georgia, that's a felony. The word hit her like a slap. Felony. Prison time. A criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. What are they asking for? Complete surrender of any claim to Russell's assets. A public apology. And restitution for legal fees and emotional distress. How much restitution? $200,000. Lorna felt the floor drop out from under her. We don't have that kind of money. Then you'd better hope Russell's feeling generous. Because if this goes to trial, you're looking at prison time and civil judgments that could bankrupt you for life. After Harold hung up, Lorna sat in her kitchen, Russell's kitchen, and tried to understand how completely she'd miscalculated. She thought she was playing chess while Russell played checkers, but it turned out she'd been playing tic-tac-toe while he played three-dimensional chess. The doorbell rang again. More reporters, probably, or process servers with more legal papers. She ignored it until the ringing became persistent. Demanding attention, on her doorstep stood a man in an expensive suit who looked disturbingly familiar. Same height as Russell, same build, same blue-gray eyes that seemed to see right through her pretenses. Mrs. Maddox? I'm Gavin Maddox, Russell's son. She stared at him, seeing Russell's features refined by better nutrition and education, shaped by confidence instead of quiet resignation. You're the one behind all this, she said. I'm the one stopping it. May I come in? Against her better judgment, she led him into the living room where she'd received Max Carter's warning weeks earlier. Gavin looked around the space with the analytical attention of someone cataloging assets. Nice house, he said. My father did good work here. What do you want? To offer you a way out. Gavin sat in Russell's chair, just as Max had done, claiming the space with casual authority. The charges can go away. The media attention can stop. You can keep the house and enough money to start over somewhere else. What's the catch? You apologize. Publicly. Admit what you did was wrong. Take responsibility for the harm you caused. Lorna felt her pride rebel against the idea. And if I refuse, then we go to trial. You lose everything, including your freedom. Your daughter faces the same charges. This is blackmail. This is consequences. Gavin's voice was calm, matter of fact. You made choices, Mrs. Maddox. Now you get to live with them. He stood and handed her a business card. You have 48 hours to decide. After that, the offer expires and we take our chances with a jury. After he left, Lorna called Hadley and told her about the visit. They spent hours discussing their options, but the conversation kept circling back to the same inescapable truth. They were beaten, outmaneuvered by people who played the game better than they did. Maybe we should take the deal, Hadley said finally. That means admitting we were wrong. Mom, we were wrong. We destroyed a good man for no reason except selfishness. Maybe it's time to face that. Lorna looked around the house Russell had made into a home, at the crown molding he'd installed by hand, at the kitchen cabinets he'd built in his workshop. She'd lived here for 15 years without really seeing the love that had gone into every corner, every carefully measured joint, every perfectly aligned detail. For the first time since the retirement dinner, she wondered if Russell would ever forgive her. Then she wondered if she deserved forgiveness, even if he offered it. Call them, she told Hadley. Tell them we'll take the deal. The Waffle House sat on Highway 441 like a beacon of normalcy in a world that had turned upside down. Lorna arrived first, choosing a booth in the back where she could see the parking lot and prepare herself for what would probably be the hardest conversation of her life. She'd spent 3 days crafting the apology that would appear in the Athens Banner Herald. 3 days finding the right words to acknowledge the harm she'd caused without completely destroying what remained of her dignity. The lawyers had reviewed every sentence, making sure it met the terms of the settlement, while leaving her enough pride to continue living till Russell's truck pulled into the parking lot at exactly 2 o'clock. He'd always been punctual, one of those reliable traits she'd taken for granted during their marriage. He sat in the cab for a moment, probably steeling himself for this encounter the same way she had. He looked older when he walked through the door, his hair grayer, his face marked by lines that hadn't been there 3 months ago. But he carried himself differently now, straighter, more confident, like a man who'd remembered his own worth. He slid into the booth across from her without a word, his eyes taking in her appearance with the same analytical attention she remembered from their early days together. She dressed carefully for this meeting, choosing clothes that said penitent without looking desperate. "You look tired," he said finally. "I'm tired. Tired of fighting, tired of being angry, tired of pretending this was anyone's fault but mine." The waitress approached, and Russell ordered coffee, black, the same way he'd drunk it for 30 years. Lorna asked for water, her stomach too twisted to handle anything else. "Gavin says you wanted to talk," Russell said when they were alone again. "I wanted to apologize. Really apologize. Not just the public statement the lawyers wrote." Russell nodded, but didn't speak, waiting for her to continue. It was another trait she'd forgotten, his willingness to let silence do the work that words couldn't handle. "I convinced myself that you didn't love me anymore," she said. "That you were just going through the motions, staying married out of habit. I used that as justification for everything that came after. Did you ever ask me how I felt?" "No. I was afraid of the answer." "What answer were you afraid of?" Lorna stared at her water glass, watching condensation form droplets that ran down the sides like tears. "I was afraid you'd tell me the truth. That you stayed because you thought it was your duty, not because you wanted to be there. And if I had told you that, I would have felt justified in doing what I did. It would have been easier than admitting I'd fallen out of love with you, and was too much of a coward to say so." Russell leaned back against the vinyl booth, processing her words. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows on his face, making him look older and harder than the man she'd married 31 years ago. "When did you stop loving me?" he asked. The question cut through her like a blade. She'd expected anger, accusations, demands for explanations. She hadn't expected this quiet request for honesty. "I don't know. It wasn't a moment. It was erosion. Like water wearing away stone. One day I looked at you and realized I felt nothing except obligation." "How long?" 5 years. Maybe 6. Russell absorbed this information without visible reaction, the same way he'd absorbed news of equipment failures and schedule changes during his working years. "Why didn't you leave then?" "Because leaving would have meant starting over. Because I was 54 years old and scared of being alone. Because it was easier to stay and blame you for my unhappiness than to take responsibility for my own life." She reached across the table and touched his hand, feeling calluses earned through decades of honest work. "I know you can't forgive me. I'm not asking you to. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I destroyed." Russell looked down at her hand on his, then back at her face. "You didn't destroy anything, Lorna. You just revealed what was already broken. We weren't always broken. No, we weren't. For about 10 years, we were happy. Really happy. But people change, and we changed in different directions." The waitress refilled his coffee cup and disappeared again, leaving them alone with 31 years of history spread between them like a map of places they'd never be able to revisit. "I heard about Gavin," Lorna said. "He seems like a good man." "He is. Better than I deserve, considering. You should have told me about him." "Maybe. But you never asked about my life before we met, and after a while it seemed too late to bring up." Lorna felt the weight of all the conversations they'd never had, all the truths they'd avoided in favor of comfortable lies. She wondered if their marriage might have survived if they'd been braver, more honest, more willing to face difficult realities. "What happens now?" she asked. "You move on. Start over. Figure out who you want to be without someone else to blame for your choices. And you, same thing." Russell finished his coffee and stood, leaving a $5 bill on the table. "Take care of yourself, Lorna." "I mean that." She watched him walk away, noting the straightness of his shoulders, the confidence in his stride. He'd found something in the wreckage of their marriage, not happiness, maybe, but something better. Peace, perhaps. Or just the satisfaction of knowing he'd fought back and won. She sat alone in the booth until the waitress asked if she needed anything else. Then she drove home to pack the belongings she'd be allowed to keep and prepare for a future she'd have to build without the safety net of someone else's devotion. The Oconee County Courthouse smelled like old wood and older justice, its courtroom filled with the kind of people who came to watch other people's lives fall apart. Lorna sat at the defendant's table with Harold Griggs, trying to maintain her composure while reporters filled the gallery behind her. Judge Patricia Williams had been on the bench for 20 years, long enough to see every variation of human greed and stupidity that Georgia law could address. She'd read the case files, watched the recorded evidence, and listened to testimony that painted Lorna as exactly the kind of person she'd spent 2 decades protecting innocent victims from. Mrs. Maddox, Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd heard every excuse and believed none of them. You've entered a plea of guilty to charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and theft by deception. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. And you understand that by entering this plea, you're admitting to conspiring with Bo Riker to defraud your former husband of his retirement benefits. Yes, Your Honor. Lorna could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom burning into her back. Former friends, neighbors, people who'd known her for years and were now seeing her true character revealed in the harsh light of legal proceedings. The court accepts your plea, Judge Williams continued. Given the terms of the settlement agreement and your cooperation with authorities, I'm sentencing you to 2 years probation and restitution in the amount of $50,000. It was less than the $200,000 originally demanded, but still more money than Lorna had access to. She'd have to sell everything she owned and work for years to pay off the debt, assuming she could find anyone willing to hire a convicted felon. Hadley's sentencing was even more humiliating. At 28, she had decades ahead of her to live with the consequences of her choices. The judge was less lenient with someone young enough to know better, imposing a year of community service on top of probation and restitution. You betrayed a man who spent his entire adult life providing for your family, Judge Williams told her. You showed him no mercy when you had power over him. Don't expect mercy from this court. After the hearing, Lorna found herself on the courthouse steps facing a crowd of reporters and angry citizens who'd followed the case through local media. Someone shouted, "Gold digger." Another voice called her a disgrace to Georgia womanhood. She pushed through the crowd with her head down, Harold Griggs running interference until they reached his car. The drive home was silent, both of them exhausted by the weight of public humiliation. At the house, Russell's house, which she'd have to vacate within 30 days, Lorna found Hadley loading boxes into a rental truck. Her daughter looked hollow, aged beyond her years by the realization that actions had consequences and choices couldn't be undone. "Where will you go?" Lorna asked. "Tennessee. I've got a friend there who says I can stay until I figure things out." "What about work? Who's going to hire me? My name's been in every newspaper in the state. Google my name, and the first 50 results are about how I betrayed my own father." Lorna wanted to comfort her daughter, to tell her that time would heal these wounds and life would get better. But she'd lost the right to offer false hope when she'd chosen to prioritize greed over family. "I'm sorry," she said instead, "for all of it. For dragging you into this, for setting such a terrible example, for teaching you that love was something you could use as a weapon." Hadley hugged her briefly, then pulled away. "Maybe we'll both learn something from this. Maybe that's the point." After Hadley left, Lorna walked through the empty house one last time. Every room held memories of a life. She'd thrown away birthday parties in the kitchen, Christmas mornings in the living room, quiet evenings when she and Russell had actually talked to each other instead of just coexisting. She'd burned it all down for money she'd never received, for a man who'd abandoned her at the first sign of trouble, for reasons that seemed incomprehensible now. The house would go to Russell, who'd probably sell it and use the money to build something better with people who deserve his trust. But on her way out, she left a single envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside was a letter she'd written but would never send, apologizing for things that couldn't be forgiven and explaining feelings she'd never had the courage to share. It wasn't meant for Russell, it was meant for her, a final acknowledgement of everything she'd lost through her own choices. 6 months after the courthouse humiliation, Russell stood in the doorway of Maddox and Son Engineering Services, watching Gavin explain gear ratios to a group of young veterans who'd come to learn trades that couldn't be outsourced or automated. The workshop smelled like metal shavings and machine oil, familiar scents that reminded him why he'd loved his work for 40 years. The building had been a furniture warehouse before they converted it, transforming empty space into something that served a purpose. Workbenches lined the walls, each equipped with precision tools and measuring instruments. CNC machines hummed in one corner while welding stations sparked in another. The key is understanding that every measurement matters, Gavin was saying to his students. Get sloppy with tolerances and the whole project fails. Russell smiled at the lesson. His son had inherited his precision, his attention to detail, his understanding that good work required good tools and careful thought. But Gavin had added something Russell had never possessed: the ability to teach, to inspire, to help other people discover their own capabilities. Max Carter emerged from the clinic next door, her nurse's uniform replaced by work clothes that showed she'd been helping with the renovation. She'd taken early retirement from the VA hospital to run medical services for veterans who couldn't afford traditional health care. Busy day, she said, settling beside Russell on the loading dock that served as their informal break area. Good kind of busy. Gavin's a natural teacher. Takes after his father that way. Russell considered this. I never taught anyone anything. Just did my job and went home. You taught him by example. Showed him what integrity looks like, what happens when a man keeps his word. That's the most important lesson there is. Through the workshop windows, Russell could see his son demonstrating proper use of a micrometer, his hands moving with the same careful precision Russell had learned from his own father decades ago. The circle was completing itself, knowledge passing from one generation to the next in an unbroken chain. Wyatt approached from the direction of the anchor, carrying a bottle of bourbon and 3 glasses. It was Friday evening, their weekly ritual of decompressing from the week's work while planning the next week's projects. Got a letter today, Wyatt said, pouring 3 fingers of bourbon into each glass. From that daughter of yours. Russell felt his stomach tighten. What did she want? To apologize, mostly. Says she's working at a diner in Nashville, trying to pay off her debts and figure out her life. Russell took the letter from Wyatt's outstretched hand, noting the return address and the careful handwriting that reminded him of Hadley as a child, when she'd still believed her father was a hero instead of an obstacle to overcome. The letter was short, written on cheap stationery that probably came from a dollar store. Hadley admitted her mistakes, acknowledged the harm she'd caused, and asked not for forgiveness but for the chance to prove she'd learned from her failures. She wants a visit, Russell said after reading it through twice. What do you think? Russell looked at the photograph tucked into the letter, Hadley in a waitress uniform, her face thinner and older but scrawled with the words "I was wrong" across the bottom. Without a word, Russell walked to the workshop's wood-burning stove they used for heat during winter months. He opened the door and tossed the letter and photograph into the flames, watching them curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. Some bridges can't be rebuilt, he said, returning to his seat. Max and Wyatt exchanged glances but said nothing. They understood that some betrayals cut too deep for healing, that some trust once broken could never be restored. As the sun set over Savannah, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Russell felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness, that was too simple a word for the complex mixture of satisfaction, peace, and cautious optimism that filled his chest. But something better than happiness, something more durable, that he'd lost a wife and gained a son, lost a family built on lies and gained friends who chose to stand beside him, lost illusions about love and loyalty and gained realistic understanding of what those words actually meant. The workshop would help other men find their way, just as Gavin had helped him find his. Max's clinic would heal bodies while the anchor healed spirits. Together, they'd built something that mattered, something that would outlast their individual lives. Behind him, he heard Gavin dismiss his students for the day, the young men filing out with the satisfied exhaustion that came from honest work well done. His son approached the loading dock, wiping machine oil from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. Good class tonight, Russell said. They're eager to learn. Reminds me of myself when I was starting out. You thinking about expanding? Maybe offer advanced courses? Already working on it. Found a guy who used to teach at Georgia Tech. Lost his job in the last round of budget cuts. He's interested in helping us develop a formal curriculum. Russell nodded, pleased but not surprised. Gavin had inherited his mechanical aptitude, but added the kind of vision and ambition that could turn a good idea into something transformative. Your mother will be proud, Russell said. Think so. I know so. She always said you'd do something important with your life. Guess she was right. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky while the sounds of the city settled into evening rhythms. Father and son, separated by 34 years of mistakes and misunderstandings, but connected now by shared purpose and hard-won understanding that Russell's pocket buzzed with a text message. He pulled out his phone and saw Hadley's name on the screen, her first direct communication since the courthouse steps. Thank you for reading my letter. I understand if you never want to see me again, but I had to try. I'm different now. I hope someday I can prove that to you. Russell showed the message to Gavin, who read it without expression. What do you think? Russell asked. I think she hurt you badly. I think she doesn't deserve your forgiveness. Gavin paused, considering his words. But I also think I spent 34 years believing I didn't deserve your attention, and I was wrong about that. Russell typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Finally, he settled on something simple and honest. Come visit when you're ready. We'll see what happens. He sent the message before he could change his mind, then put the phone away and picked up his bourbon glass. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt, some trust couldn't be restored, some relationships couldn't survive the weight of betrayal and disappointment, but some could. And maybe, in a world that seemed determined to tear people apart, that was miracle enough. Russell sat on the loading dock as darkness fell over Savannah, surrounded by the sounds of honest work and honest friendship. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn called across the water, carrying cargo and dreams and possibilities toward horizons that couldn't be seen but could still be reached. Max finished locking up the clinic and joined them on the dock. Her day's work complete, but her purpose fulfilled. Wyatt poured another round of bourbon, the good stuff reserved for moments that mattered. Gavin emerged from the workshop with oil-stained hands and the satisfied expression of a man who'd taught something valuable to people who needed to learn it. Ever think you'd end up the villain in someone else's life? Max asked, her voice carrying the easy humor that had helped them all survive their various disasters. Russell considered the question, thinking about Lorna and Hadley and the story they'd tell themselves about their downfall. He'd been the obstacle to their dreams, the impediment to their happiness, the reason their carefully laid plans had crumbled into dust. Only when I started living like the hero, he replied. The words carried across the warm Georgia night, settling over them like a benediction. They'd all been villains in someone's story, heroes in someone else's, victims and survivors, and everything in between. But tonight, in this moment, they were simply people who'd found each other in the aftermath of their individual storms and decided to build something better from the wreckage. Russell raised his glass one final time, not in toast of victory or revenge or the satisfaction of justice served, but to the harder, more precious thing they discovered in the ruins of their former lives: trust, loyalty, the quiet satisfaction of work well done and friendships honestly earned that, in the end, it was enough. More than enough, it was everything.